Hello from the brutal capitalist dictatorship of Kuala Lumpur. I hope you're having an amazing day, because if you're having an amazing day, I'm having an amazing day. And if I'm having an amazing day, you too should be having a bloody fabulous day. Alright, first of all, I'd like to apologize in advance for not having made a video for you guys in, the last 2 weeks, I think. You see, I've been really bloody busy, it being the end of term and all. But fret not, because the holidays have started, although my salary has gone down slightly because quite a number of my students are going overseas for the holidays, but I'm staying here to fight against the bourgeoisie. I have more time to make content for you guys, so you can expect to see 2 videos a week at least. Okay? Right. So my apologies for not having made a video over the last 2 weeks. I haven't forgotten about you guys, and I certainly hope that you haven't forgotten about me. And if you haven't yet, please, I beseech you, do click the subscribe button, guys. It'll keep you updated about my latest videos, and you'll be the first to know whenever I release a new video. In fact, if you're watching my videos and you haven't clicked subscribe yet, I actually take it personally. Yes, I take it goddamn personally, right? Now, for all you hate watchers out there who are just watching my channel spewing with hate, you know what? You don't have to click the subscribe button. But to my supporters, I really would appreciate if you'd only click the subscribe button. Right? Well, that's the least you can do for me, guys, it being Christmas and all. So, would you like to get me like 1,500 subscribers by this Christmas? Would you like to make my Christmas a little bit more merry? A little merrier? A little merrier? Then please, click the subscribe button. It's not gonna kill you. Thank you. So the late Italian philosopher Umberto Eco wrote an essay entitled Ur-Fascism, which is basically a compilation of ways by which you can identify whether a nation is fascist or whether a society is fascist. Now, to add ethos to this essay, Eco was someone who grew up under Mussolini's far right-wing fascist regime. And as someone who, until recently, had been ruled by a fascist government as well, until they were voted out this year, I think I'm qualified to add my 2 cents to it, especially since Eco's essay really resonated with me, having lived under a highly right-wing fascist reactionary government, right, that had been in power since 1957 and stayed that way, by force. Okay, first thing we're going to do is we're going to consult the Learner's Dictionary, because, I have to make my definitions simple enough for an imbecile to understand, you see. So let's take a look at it. Now, I'm not saying that people who don't speak English are imbeciles, but I am saying, however, there are people whose first language is English who are imbeciles, quite palpably, judging by all the haters in my Twitter, on my Twitter page. So I'm going to read the definition of fascist. Okay, fascist. Right. Fascism, fascist is a person who has fascist views, which comes from the noun fascism. Fascism is a set of right-wing political beliefs that includes strong control of society and the economy by the state, a powerful role for the armed forces, and the prevention of political opposition. There's a very thin line between fascism and socialism. And today, we are going to draw that line. When one thinks about the word fascist, what normally comes to mind is the image of a right-wing macho man who's marching down the streets screaming for the death or deportation of anyone he doesn't like. For example, immigrants, LGBTQ people, and so on and so forth. Now, while that seems to be the most common type of fascist, the most glaringly obvious type of fascist, fascists are not always easy to spot, right? Because fascists oftentimes hide in plain sight. A fascist is not necessarily one of those hyper right-wing, super ultra right-wing proud boy types. Although they certainly are fascists, there are certainly fascists who hide better in plain sight. So by the end of this video, you will be able, hopefully, to identify which of your acquaintances or which of your relations are fascists, okay, using these 5 criteria. Now, just a disclaimer, these are 5 symptoms, 5 likely symptoms of a fascist. A man or a woman could meet all of these 5 symptoms and not be a fascist, although that is a very, very slim chance. It's almost negligible that if a person meets these 5 criteria, he or she is not a fascist. But if a person gets really, really butthurt by these 5 criteria, he or she is definitely a fascist. So without further ado, let's begin. Okay, number 1, obsession with hierarchies. Now, the fascist is always obsessed with maintaining clear-cut hierarchies between individual human beings and between groups as well. Now, fascists often like to talk about things like race realism or differences among groups of people, right? Rather than our similarities, fascists tend to focus on differences and compare which groups are better and which groups are inferior, rather than using the term racism to describe themselves, because there's no races in the world that would call themselves a racist. Even Hitler wouldn't use the word racist on himself. The fascist uses the term race realism oftentimes, right? You know, fascists, like the American fascists in the American Nazi Party, like basically likes to compare different groups and divide different groups among one another. Like they like to point at, Asian success in order to stamp down on minorities they find less tolerable because they view them as being lower on the racial totem pole. But fascists not only like to compare different races, and because it fits into their Übermensch and Untermensch worldview, fascists also like to compare different human beings, irrespective of race, and like to split people into alpha and beta. So, if you hear a man who describes the differences between men as being alpha male and beta male, who basically tells people that you should never want to be a beta male, you should want to be an alpha male, this man is likely a fascist, right? If you find a man who believes that there is a natural hierarchy in society, with them at the top, of course, because no fascists in the world would like to put themselves at the bottom, then it is likely that this man is also a fascist. If this man is obsessed with, not only alpha male or beta male, but obsessed over group differences and basically especially obsessed over things like IQ and how, how these differences basically affect human beings, this man is likely a fascist, right? So to recap the first point, a fascist is somebody who likes to split people into different categories and is obsessed basically about putting people into categories of superior and inferior, basically. A fascist cannot view differences without hierarchy, simply put. Okay? Number 2, in-group versus out-group. Now, every fascist has an in-group, and every fascist also has an out-group, because the fascist primarily relies on galvanizing his or her supporters by preying on their common prejudices. In doing so, demonizing a certain out-group. If there is a Übermensch, if you've convinced your followers that they are the alphas of society, that they are the Übermensch, there must be an Untermensch, or an underling or underman of society, in order to demonize. Now, this so-called Untermensch of society really varies according to the society in question, but it really depends on the culture or society. For example, the Nazis, Hitler and the Nazis preyed on common German anti-Semitism, or rather anti-Semitism which was a rampant sentiment due in no small part to Christian theology stemming from the Middle Ages, of course. But in Malaysia, the out-group will be people like the minorities, like the Chinese, or the transgendered people, or the homosexuals. And in America, the out-group can be either Asians or it can be Black Americans, right? But fascists always need an out-group in order to demonize, in order to rally their supporters by preying on their common prejudices. There is always going to be some group that is basically maligned by the fascists. For example, in America, some people say that Adolf Hitler was really a gay man, and basically there are some fascists in America who insist that the Nazis were these woke leftist SJWs who were pro-LGBT rights, which is quite frankly insulting. It's quite frankly insulting to all the LGBT people who were persecuted under Hitler's regime. Persecuted and killed, I should say, under Hitler's regime. You have fascists in America who don't openly support Hitler because it's not the socially acceptable thing to do, just like fascists in Malaysia will not openly support Hitler because it's not the socially acceptable thing to do. I mean, they will condemn him publicly, but one way you can really spot a fascist is not necessarily through his public condemnation of Hitler, who is supposed to be the symbol of evil, which he is, but by lumping in certain marginalized social groups with Hitler, like how the American fascists who call themselves the MAGA communists are doing, by lumping in basically LGBTQ people, the most powerless, marginalized people in America, by lumping them in with the Nazis. That's basically, as I've said, it's an insult to the gay and transgender people who suffered and were persecuted and killed by the Nazis, but it also serves to point, or rather to demonize these groups by preying on the prejudices of the Americans towards these groups, because America is a very, very conservative Christian society. There's no doubt about it. It's just like how the fascist government of Barisan Nasional demonize the Chinese and Indians. And basically, in the movie Mat Kilau, which is quite a fascist movie, I should say, the Chinese and the Indians are portrayed basically as the lackeys, the evil lackeys of the British colonials. And I'm just going to spoil what happens towards the end, but the Chinese villain meets a very, very brutal death in the end. So basically, fascists also dehumanize certain groups that they don't like and that they feel that people do not like. And I can point to you Terrance Aaron's essay on how Mat Kilau was a fascist film, basically. So just to recap, one way to do it, a fascist can demonize groups they don't like, is by comparing them to symbols of evil, like comparing the LGBTQ or the transgender community to Nazis. That's one way to do it. Another way to demonize certain groups is by portraying these groups as villains or as wicked and cruel people in movies, so that these people are basically demonized. They're basically scapegoated as the source of the majority's problem, right? In order to shift the blame and remove the resentment, right? Okay, third way you can spot a fascist is populist rhetoric. You know, the fascist always uses populist rhetoric and claims to be the true representative of the people, right? You might hear an American fascist, for example, going like, unlike these piece of shit baristas, or, these degenerate leftists, these prostitutes of the bourgeoisie, we are the true voice of the working class. The fascist claims to be a populist, claims to love the masses, and but the fact of the matter is that the fascist does not love the masses, because the fascist only loves the people in the masses who conform to his rigid right-wing worldview. And basically, when the fascist talks about improving society, or the fascist talks about improving the welfare of the population, he's certainly not talking about the social groups that he hates. For example, transgender people, or certain minorities that he doesn't like. In fact, Hitler himself called himself a national socialist, right? The word national makes a world of difference, you see, because unlike a true socialist or true Marxist, who basically believes in the, improving the welfare and material conditions of everyone in society, even if it's people he doesn't like, the fascist is very, very selective in this regard. The fascist has no intention to help the people who do not fit within his worldview, whom he considers unworthy, basically. So another way you can spot a fascist is by the fact that he uses populist rhetoric, but at the same time seems to hate certain subgroups of the population. Basically, that's it. And using terms like degenerate or enemy of humanity, etc., against people he doesn't like. Appeals to some halcyon golden age of the past, when things were better, when, for example, when the gays were in the closet, women were in the kitchen, and basically everything was hunky-dory for the fascists and people like him. That's just an example. But another way to spot a fascist is the fact that the fascist likes to basically reminisce about a golden age that never really happened, right? For example, during World War II, with the increased militarization of the far-right fascist Japan, it became really, really popular to show nationalistic samurai movies and to teach young boys to aspire towards highly toxic masculinity, right? Another key trait of the fascists is toxic masculinity, of course. Basically, this idea that to be a real man, you have to be aggressive, cruel, and brutal. And if you're not, then you are not a real man. But one way to spot whether a society is fascist is if they're looking back at ancient warrior societies or ancient warrior civilizations and are basically calling for the return of the Morris of these civilizations. And they even appeal to a past that never really existed. For example, in the film Kilau, which is a fascist film, basically the theme of that film is the idea that the Malays ought to unite against the invaders, meaning not only the British but also the Chinese and the Indians of Malaysia, who are trying to steal their livelihoods and take their lands and oppress them on their own land. So, as I've said, the fascist always has an in-group and an out-group. So the fascist also appeals to a halcyon past that never really existed, because in the time of Kilau, in the 19th century, there was no such thing as Malay nationalism, because the idea of a Malay state did not even exist back then. So the simply put, in order to inspire nationalism, in order to inspire a feeling of national pride and the desire to stamp out and stamp down on the invaders, the fascists will even concoct narratives that never really existed. For example, you see fascists like Matt Walsh describing himself as an Anglo-Saxon, when in fact the Anglo-Saxons are are virtually an extinct sort of race, or rather not extinct in the sense that they got slaughtered, but rather extinct in the sense that they were genetically outbred by different groups of people, such as the Normans and the Celts and so on and so forth, right? But then you have people like Matt Walsh talking about Anglo-Saxon racial purity. You have people like Churchill and Hitler as well talking about Anglo-Saxon racial purity, which, frankly speaking, does not even exist anymore, right? But they concoct these erroneous historical narratives in order to give people a sense of shall we say civilizational pride. In order to make them feel that their civilization is really under attack. So this really ties in strongly with number 2, but basically there's really not much difference in the rhetoric of a fascist and a socialist. Like I've said, Hitler even considered himself, or he called himself, a national socialist. The fascist feigns concern for the masses, feigns concern for the people, appoints himself a hero of the people, a voice of the people, but you can see quite palpably that the people only includes people that he likes, and certainly does not include people whom he considers subhuman or Untermensch, right? See, while socialists, Marxists and communists and socialists tend to blame systems for people's poor material conditions, the fascist tends to focus not on systems, not on powerful people either, like billionaires like Elon Musk or Donald Trump, but the fascist tends to focus on the wrong people, which means the wrong groups of people. That is to say, the most marginalized groups of people that are commonly perceived by people in the society with prejudice. Those people are pointed to as the cause of the problems of the masses, right? And basically, yeah, while socialists, communists, Marxists tend to focus on systems and blame capitalism as the problem and call for its abolition, the fascists always skirts around the abolition of capitalism, skirts around the abolition of private property, but basically points fingers at, people in the society whom he deems degenerates, basically. And that can be, for example, gay people or transgender people or gender non-conforming people or so forth and so on and so forth, okay? All right, so that's about it for today. Okay, right, let's just recap the 5 ways you can spot a fascist. Number 1, obsession with hierarchies. Number 2, us versus them dichotomy. Number 3, preys on common prejudices of the people in order to garner support. Number 4, basically appeals to a halcyon golden age that never existed. And number 5, basically, instead of blaming systems, blames the wrong people, who usually, always in fact, tend to be the most marginalized groups of people in a society, right? So, I hope you've learned something new today, and I have to repeat that even if a person meets all 5 of these criteria, he's not necessarily a fascist. But of course, there is a 99% chance that he is a fascist, but there's a negligible chance, a 1% chance that he might not be a fascist. He might just have a very misguided way of looking at the world, but that chance is negligible. But if this man gets butthurt by this list and insists that these are not signs of fascism, that man is definitely a fascist. Okay? All right, thank you everyone, and have a lovely day, and stay away from fascists, right?